It is the morning of the 22nd of November 1963. The people of Dallas, Texas, line the streets in excited anticipation as soon the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, and the First Lady will pass through the city in their motorcade. At first, all seems well. However, after the procession turns the corner from North Houston Street onto Elm Street, shots ring out from the direction of the Texas Book Depository. Panic ensues as two more shots are fired in quick succession and the motorcade speeds away. Later that day, the news is broadcast of the death of John F. Kennedy, and a manhunt begins for the book depository employee who police believe assassinated the President of the United States. The man's name? Lee Harvey Oswald. The man known to history as Lee Harvey Oswald was born on the 18th of October 1939 in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, in the United States. His father, Robert Oswald, was an insurance agent who died of a heart attack just 2 months before Lee was born. His mother, Marguerite Claverie, worked as a receptionist for a law firm prior to her first marriage. Marguerite was first married at the age of 22 to Edward John Pick Jr. in 1929, but the couple separated within 2 years. She gave birth to her eldest child, John, in 1932, and she and Edward Pick divorced in 1933. During their separation, Marguerite met Robert Edward Lee Oswald, a premium collector at the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, who was also in the process of divorcing his wife. In July of 1933, just 6 months after Oswald secured his divorce, he and Marguerite were married. Marguerite described her years of marriage to Robert Oswald as the happiest of her life. The couple welcomed another son, Robert, in 1934. Lee Harvey Oswald was born into a family still grieving the loss of his father and into financial circumstances that promised to become complicated fairly quickly. Marguerite and her 3 children remained in their home on Alva Street in New Orleans for several months after Robert Oswald died, but the payout from his life insurance soon began to dwindle, and Marguerite knew she would have to find work. She reduced her childcare burden by placing her 2 older sons in a Catholic boarding school. Marguerite then sold the family home, purchased a smaller house, and opened up a little notions shop in the front, selling small gifts, candies, and sewing supplies. She took Robert and John out of boarding school, and they happily returned to their former elementary day school. The family even had a pet dog named Sunshine during this brief period of hope for the family, an animal that Lee particularly loved. Unfortunately, Marguerite's business failed, and she was forced to sell her house once again. The Oswalds' family life and finances remained continuously unstable throughout Lee's childhood and adolescence. Unable to support her family without working, but also unable to secure daily childcare for her 3 sons, Marguerite placed her 2 older boys in a local orphanage, paying $20 a month for their board, food, and clothing. Lee was still a toddler and far too young to be placed in the orphanage, so Marguerite moved the 2 of them into an apartment and hired babysitters for Lee while she went out to work as a telephone operator. This arrangement soon proved to be unworkable. Marguerite complained to her sister, Lillian, that the nannies she had hired neglected and mistreated Lee, but two of his former babysitters told very different stories. Lee was an angry, sullen, and disobedient child, they said. They claimed he often became violent and destructive when angry, hitting out at people and even smashing his mother's chandelier on one occasion. Marguerite managed to persuade her sister Lillian to take care of Lee while she was at work. Lee's Aunt Lillian saw a different side of the boy than his babysitters did. Lillian described him as a sunny and sweet child who was glad to hold her hand when she took him for walks. Everyone would always comment on what an adorable child he was, Lillian remembered. Lee's dramatic behavioural variations may have had something to do with Lillian's personality versus her sister's. Lillian loved children. She had 5 children herself and loved being a mother. Her sister, Marguerite, Lillian recalled, would probably have replied resentfully that it was easy to love being a mother when one had a reliable husband to take care of her and didn't have to work. Lillian, of course, agreed, but she remembered Marguerite had never seemed to particularly love being a mother, even when things were going well. Both John and Robert, Lee's older brothers, recalled feeling as though their mother resented having to take care of them, that they made her life difficult. It was not as if she did not love them, or that she did not work hard to keep them sheltered, fed, and clothed, and yet neither could remember receiving much affection or meaningful attention or interest from her. He and his brothers, he remembered, had always felt like burdens to Marguerite. Lillian eventually had to insist that Marguerite take greater responsibility for Lee's daily childcare when the challenge of caring for a 6th child became too much for her. Less than 6 months later, Marguerite placed Lee in the same orphanage as his brothers, paying $10 a month for his fees. The boys remained there together for another year while their mother worked and rented the cheapest apartment possible. Increasingly resentful at having to be responsible for his 2 younger brothers, John believed that his mother had deposited them in the orphanage not just to save money on the family's living expenses, but to avoid childcare responsibilities altogether. It now fell to 11-year-old John to take care of 8-year-old Robert and 3-year-old Lee. In 1944, Marguerite removed her sons from the orphanage and the family moved to Dallas, Texas. It was there that she reconnected with Edwin Ekdahl, an electrical engineer she had first met while working as a boutique shop manager on Canal Street back in New Orleans. Ekdahl initially hired Marguerite to cook and housekeep for him after her move to Dallas, but this arrangement soon turned into an offer of marriage. Her sons took to the white-haired and jovial Ekdahl immediately. For Lee, he was the closest thing to a father the boy had ever had. Ekdahl was kind and indulgent with John, Robert, and Lee, bringing home treats and sweets for them, taking them for rides in his car, and taking them to the movies. Marguerite was more cautious than her sons. She cared for Ekdahl, but wondered if she really loved him enough to contemplate a 3rd marriage. She worried also about his age and health. Ekdahl had already suffered 2 heart attacks, and Marguerite wondered whether it would be wise to settle down with someone who might soon leave her a widow again. In the summer of 1945, she married him in spite of these doubts. For a little over a year, the family seemed quite happy. John and Robert were enrolled in military school, but their stepfather wrote them frequent letters, and both boys returned home regularly for long weekends and holidays. Marguerite enrolled Lee at a local elementary day school. Both Marguerite and Lee travelled with Ekdal on his many business trips, enjoying the fine hotels and restaurants in the cities they visited together. Unfortunately, Marguerite's marriage to Ekdal soon began to break down. Her chief complaint with her new husband was that he maintained total control over all finances, kept her on a budget of $100 per month, and refused to share information with her about the family's overall financial situation. Marguerite did not appreciate being micromanaged, and their marriage suffered the first of several separations, beginning in 1947. When it seemed they might finally get back together, no one was happier than Lee, who was now attending his third elementary school in less than 2 years as a result of his mother and stepfather's marital troubles and Marguerite's constant moving. But before the reconciliation could be completed, Marguerite discovered Ekdal had been having an affair. She initiated divorce proceedings against him, in the course of which all 3 of her sons were called to give evidence in court. Perhaps certain that he was about to lose the only father he'd ever had, 8-year-old Lee flatly refused to testify, saying that he wouldn't know right from wrong and the truth from a falsehood. Marguerite did not fare well in the divorce. Though she had proof of her husband's infidelity, Edwin Ekdal testified that Marguerite had been aggressive and physically abusive towards him, driving him out of the family home when she was angry. He claimed she threw bottles and glasses at his head and hit out at him with no regard for his heart condition. The jury sided with Ekdal and awarded Marguerite only $1,500, her jewelry, clothing and furniture in the settlement. Marguerite purchased a small house in Dallas, next to the railroad tracks, and enrolled Lee in yet another school. Their family, his older brother John remembered, was back down at the bottom again. Over the next few years, the Oswalds' home life remained consistently unstable. The impact on John and Robert was painful, but less dramatic than the impact on Lee. John and Robert spent a good deal of their time away at school, where they had each other as well as their own interests and friends. Lee was at home with his mother. He made no friends. He averaged no more than 10 or 11 months at any one home address and changed schools nearly as often. As he grew more and more isolated, family members and neighbours began to note that his angry and violent tendencies likewise increased. Lee was already in the 4th grade before any of his teachers took serious note of how poor his reading and spelling were. Though dyslexia had not yet been identified as a learning disability at the time, his 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Livingston, seemed to understand that Lee needed a great deal more attention and differentiated instruction. She was one of the few people that managed to develop real trust and rapport with the boy, and his literacy and general aptitude increased under her tutelage. He gave her a puppy for Christmas, giving him the excuse to visit Mrs. Livingston and her family over the holidays. Unfortunately, though he seemed to like learning more after he began to overcome his literacy challenges, he nonetheless began to avoid school more and more as time went on. Already at 9 years old, Lee was expected to be independent. His teachers were surprised to learn that he almost always came home to an empty house. His mother was at work, Lee said, and he reckoned he could open a can of soup as good as anyone and entertain himself with comic books or radio and television programs until she came home. Lee's Aunt Lillian grew increasingly concerned about the boy's self-imposed isolation. When he visited his aunt's family in Louisiana, Lillian would try in vain to persuade Lee to accompany her and his cousins on family outings. The silent and unsmiling boy would simply shake his head and go back to reading his comic books, content to stay in his room alone. While some of his family members and teachers worried about his tendency to isolate himself, others were beginning to see an increasingly dark side. One former neighbor reported that he had seen Lee lose his temper and chase his brother Robert with a butcher knife. Another revealed that Lee sometimes stalked up and down the street outside his house, throwing rocks at passing children. Marguerite either failed to see or refused to acknowledge the seriousness of these incidents, and invariably dismissed the concerns that others shared with her about her son's violent behavior. "Boys will be boys," she would say, shrugging off major warnings of Lee's worsening mental state. Marguerite's parenting style failed to give Lee any structure and likewise failed to help him learn to manage his emotions and impulses. She loved her son, but as an extension of herself. She may have even fancied herself his friend, but Lee later said that he never felt that his mother was particularly interested in him. She seemed to appreciate his independence and preference for being alone. It made her job as a working parent much easier. She defended him from critics of his behavior and never punished or chastised him. This likely had the effect of increasing Lee's resentment and sense of isolation. It may be that his antisocial and destructive behavior was a cry for help and attention, and yet Marguerite failed to respond to or address very clear red flags in her son's conduct. By the time Lee reached adolescence, his brothers had both moved out and started careers and families of their own. John had enlisted in the Navy, and Robert had enlisted in the Marines. In the spring of 1952, 12-year-old Lee travelled to New York City to stay with his brother John, who was newly married with a baby daughter and serving in the Coast Guard. It was a fun family reunion for a few weeks, during which John took his little brother sightseeing all over New York City. Tensions arose when Marguerite arrived, unannounced, several large suitcases in tow. Apparently, having encountered difficult financial circumstances once again, she had decided to move in with her eldest son for the foreseeable future. The family's living arrangements became unworkable within less than 2 months. Marguerite aggravated her daughter-in-law with her criticism and her clear expectation that the young couple would take care of her, even though she made no offer to contribute to household expenses. But worse, Lee's erratic and angry behavior frightened both John and his wife. When John heard that the boy had lost his temper during an argument over the TV, had slapped his mother, and threatened his sister-in-law with a pocket knife, John confronted both Lee and his mother. Marguerite defended Lee and claimed that her daughter-in-law had exaggerated the incident. Lee had a temper, Marguerite acknowledged, but he wouldn't hurt anyone. "It was just a little knife," she protested. "Not a kitchen knife or a butcher knife." John asked both Marguerite and Lee to leave. It was the beginning of a rift between the brothers which would take nearly a decade to heal. Marguerite and Lee remained in New York for several months, during which time they lived at 2 different addresses in the Bronx, and Lee was enrolled in middle school. His attendance was exceptionally poor, and he skipped as much as 75% of his classes. Less and less interested in school and convinced it could teach him nothing he couldn't learn on his own, Lee preferred to roam through the city, visiting museums or galleries, going to movies, soda fountains and comic book shops, or simply riding the subway around the city all day. His favourite place to visit was the Bronx Zoo, where he could wander and watch the animals with contented fascination. It wasn't long before his outrageously poor attendance got him picked up by a New York truant officer. Lee's apprehension by the state's juvenile authorities for failing to attend school was a real opportunity for intervention. Now that his troubling behaviour and mental state were a documented matter of public record, there was a chance for his life to turn a corner. The social workers and child psychologists who interacted with him were deeply troubled, but also impressed. Lee was an angry and difficult boy, but quite intelligent. Interviews with him showcased an impressive vocabulary for his age, and his aptitude test revealed an IQ of 118. Yet he showed almost no ability to self-regulate, to manage his emotions, or to see goals or plans through to completion. When confronted with the disappointing realities of life versus how he believed life should be, anger was immediately his first instinct. Such cognitive dissonance invariably led him to violence. He seemed terribly lost, and already beginning to waste his clear potential. One psychologist described him as deeply disturbed emotionally with schizoid tendencies, who suffers under the impact of emotional isolation and deprivation, lack of affection, absence of family life, and rejection by a self-involved and conflicted mother. Had the truant officers and social workers had time to implement interventions in Lee's case, his life might have taken another trajectory. As it was, Marguerite was outraged with what she perceived as meddling by bureaucratic busybodies, and after promising a judge that Lee's attendance would improve without further need for intervention, she instead promptly moved back to New Orleans with her son, effectively removing him from the influence and jurisdiction of New York's educational and juvenile authorities. When Lee returned to school in New Orleans, his attendance record remained spotty. When he did go to school, he frequently got into fights with other boys, though he managed to make friends with at least one of his classmates during 8th grade, a boy named Edward Vobel. Lee and Edward liked to knock off school and throw darts or shoot pool at a billiards hall near Lee's house. Vobel recalled a particularly nasty series of fights which occurred after a group of boys saw Lee board a New Orleans city bus one day and sit in the segregated section. Having just moved from New York, he did not know that the back of the bus was the colored section. The boys beat him up. A few days later, Lee got 2 of them back, surprising them on the street and punching 2 of them in the face. One of the boys punched Lee in the mouth so hard he needed dental work to fix the damage. Though Lee never did finish his education, only making it as far as the 10th grade before dropping out, he still enjoyed learning and read a great deal. At the public library, he discovered socialist literature which fascinated him, particularly Karl Marx's Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. Marx's philosophy resonated deeply with Lee and influenced him greatly. Here, he thought, was a philosophy which perfectly encapsulated everything he thought was wrong with the United States. He became convinced that the oppression of workers like his mother and the cruel structural racism he saw everywhere in the United States was all rooted in the capitalism and imperialism by which America had always been guided. Perhaps most attractive of all, political and ideological outrage gave him a focus for his anger. Lee's family members and neighbors began to notice a change in his normally silent and isolated behavior during his early to mid-teens. While he was still wary of making friends in general, he now became more and more argumentative, confrontational, and arrogant, particularly when it came to politics. His frequently loud expression of opinions proved aggravating to most people he interacted with. One neighbor recalled the 15-year-old Lee arriving home and yelling rudely at Marguerite, "Ma, where's my supper?" And yet, instead of chastising him for his disrespect, she rushed to accommodate him. By age 16, Lee was already anxious to leave home. According to his brother Robert, Lee found life with his mother nearly intolerable, and he sensed that she would soon ask him to go out to work in order to take care of her. Lee, however, had no intention of playing the role of the dutiful son. Midway through his 10th grade school year, he forged his mother's signature on a document formalizing his withdrawal from high school and promptly dropped out without informing his family. He tried to enlist in the military, as his older brothers John and Robert had done, but he was still too young to be accepted for service. He worked several successive part-time jobs as a clerk and a messenger while he waited for his 17th birthday, after which he was accepted for service and began training for the Marines. Initially, Lee quite distinguished himself in his Marine Corps training. Following basic training, he began an aircraft communications engineering course at which he excelled, placing 7th in a class of 30 trainees. He also proved to be an excellent shot, scoring high enough on his marksmanship exam to qualify as a sharpshooter. In the spring of 1957, Oswald was posted to the naval base in Atsugi, Japan, where he served for most of the next 2 years, other than a short stint in the Philippines. Lee's military record ultimately proved to be less than impressive. He was court-martialed twice during his rather short career as a Marine, once for possession of an unauthorized firearm and a second time for disputing one of his superiors over his first court-martial. Despite a promising beginning in the Marine Corps, Lee's dissatisfaction was obvious in more ways than one. Not only did he promptly turn sour on his military career, but his unhappiness in his personal and family life, as well as his identification with Marxism, led him to consider a life path outside the United States. As soon as late 1956 or early 1957, Lee Harvey Oswald had likely already begun to consider defecting to the Soviet Union. Quite of his own volition, he began to study the Russian language intensively. His fellow Marines, bemused by Lee's open espousal of Marxism and his study of Russian, nicknamed him Oswaldskovich. In 1958, Lee's superiors invited him to take a Russian language test. While his listening skills were judged to be weak, and his spoken Russian was only marginally better, he acquitted himself quite impressively at the reading and writing portions of the test. In 1959, Lee applied for and received a hardship discharge from the Marine Corps, claiming that his mother could no longer manage without financial support and that it was his duty to support her. When he returned to New Orleans, however, he stayed with his mother for less than 2 months before booking passage overseas. He departed quietly for Le Havre, France, at the beginning of October. From France, he sailed across the English Channel to Southampton and then flew to Helsinki, where he applied for a Soviet visitor's visa. He arrived in Moscow on the 16th of October and checked into an hotel. The very next day, he visited the American embassy to inquire about renouncing his American citizenship and becoming a Soviet citizen. During his first few weeks in Moscow, Lee did not behave much like a tourist or like someone who was genuinely interested in getting to know Russia or Russian people. He mostly stayed in his hotel room, only venturing out when he had to. He spent most of his time waiting anxiously to see whether the Soviet authorities would accept his request for citizenship. He began writing in what he called his historic diary. No doubt Lee, who had only just turned 20 years old, believed that he was now documenting the real beginning of an independent and truly consequential life. On his father's side, Lee was third cousin to Teddy Roosevelt and fifth cousin to Confederate General Robert E. Lee, for whom his father, his brother Robert, and Lee himself had all been named. Lee believed and hoped that he was destined for great things, that he was a man of history. Both the American embassy and the Soviet authorities were baffled by Oswald. He struck the staff at the embassy as ridiculously idealistic. The American embassy in Moscow strongly insisted that Oswald take more time to consider. Renunciation of citizenship was quite serious and often irrevocable, especially in the context of Russia, the United States, and the Cold War. They urged Lee to take more time to consider, and Lee, angry at not being taken seriously, stormed out of the embassy, leaving his passport behind. He then appealed to the Soviet authorities directly, expressing his wish to become a Soviet citizen. The Soviets seemed just as baffled as the Americans at Oswald's request, and, wary of the strange young man who seemed not to understand exactly where he had landed, they denied his application within less than a week. Lee's diary entry for the 21st of October records his distress and bitter disappointment. Evening, 6 p.m. Received word from police official. I must leave country tonight at 8 p.m. as visa expires. I am shocked. My dreams. I retire to my room. I have $100 left. I have waited for 2 years to be accepted. My fondest dreams are shattered because of a petty official. 7 p.m. I decide to end it. When Rimmer comes at 8 o'clock to find me dead, it will be a great shock. Somewhere, a violin plays as I watch my life whirl away. I think to myself, how easy to die, and a sweet death to violins. When Oswald's Soviet liaison arrived at his hotel room, she found that he had indeed attempted to take his own life. Lee was hospitalized, where he received treatment for his injuries. He was then confined to a psychiatric ward for a week. It was not until January of 1960 that the Soviet authorities finally decided to allow Oswald to stay in Russia. He was not made a Soviet citizen, nor did he go through a formal renunciation of his American citizenship, but he was given a legal residence permit usually extended to stateless foreigners. "Still, I am happy," Lee wrote in his diary. "The official says they are sending me to the city of Minsk. I ask, is that in Siberia? He only laughs." Lee arrived in Minsk by train on the 7th of January 1960 and was welcomed and well treated by the authorities. Not only had his hotel and hospital bills been paid off by the government, but he was given a job and a fully furnished apartment which cost him only 60 rubles per month. He would make 700 rubles per month at his job, plus an additional salary subsidy of 700 rubles from the government. This made Lee quite well off by working-class Soviet standards. In fact, he earned roughly the same salary as the manager of the factory where he worked. Lee was given a job as a machine operator at an electronics factory which made televisions and radios. He was quite happy with his apartment, which had a full kitchen and bathroom. It was only a 10-minute walk from work and had a lovely view of the river. Before he had left Moscow, Lee had written to his mother and his brother Robert for what he believed was the last time. "I do not wish to ever contact you again," Lee wrote to Robert and Marguerite. "I am beginning a new life, and I don't want any part of the old." Lee's diary indicates that he was initially quite contented in Minsk. He made friends at the factory where he worked. As a rare foreigner from a country that loomed large in the Russian imagination, but which they knew very little about, people found him very interesting. He was out on the dating scene almost immediately and wrote small details in his diary about the women he was having mostly casual relationships with. Within only a few months, however, he began to see the downside to life in a remote small town in the Soviet Union. Only a week after his arrival, he wrote about how much he disliked the compulsory physical training that he and his co-workers had to complete every morning, which he said suggested shades of H.G. Wells. In an August-September entry, he wrote, "As my Russian improves, I become increasingly conscious of just what sort of a society I live in. Mass gymnastics, compulsory after-work meetings, usually political information meetings, compulsory attendance at lectures, and the sending of the entire shop collective, except me, to pick potatoes on a Sunday at a state collective farm. A patriotic duty to bring in the harvest. The opinions of the workers, unvoiced, are that it's a great pain in the neck. They don't seem to be especially enthusiastic about any of the collective duties. A natural feeling." During the autumn of 1960, Lee began dating Ella German, one of his co-workers at the factory. His diary makes clear that Lee fell deeply in love with Ella. They dated through the fall and early winter. Lee met her family on multiple occasions and was on good terms with them. In January of 1961, Lee proposed to Ella and was heartbroken when she said she could not accept. She hesitates, then refuses, Lee wrote in his diary. "My love is real, but she has none for me. Her reason, besides lack of love, is that I am American and someday might be arrested simply because of that. There is too much against you and you don't even know it," she said. I am stunned. She snickers at my awkwardness in turning to go. I am too stunned to think. I realize she was never serious with me, but only exploited my being an American in order to get the envy of the other girls who consider me different from the Russian boys. I am miserable. Only a few weeks later, Lee seemed thoroughly disenchanted and disillusioned with his life in Russia. I am starting to reconsider my desire about staying, he wrote. The work is drab and the money I get has nowhere to be spent. No nightclubs or bowling alleys, no places of recreation except the trade union dances. I have had enough. On February the 1st, Lee reached out to the American embassy in Moscow and informed them that he wanted to return to the US and asked their help in initiating the process. I now live in a state of expectation about going back to the US, he wrote in early March. Lee's diary entry for March the 17th reads, Erich and I went to a trade union dance. Boring, but at the last hour I'm introduced to a girl with a French hairdo and red dress with white slippers. I dance with her. Then I ask to show her home, which I do along with 5 other admirers. Her name is Marina. We like each other right away. She gives me her phone number and departs home in a taxi. I walk home. 21-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald and 19-year-old Marina Prusakova had a whirlwind courtship, and he asked her to marry him after just 6 weeks. An April entry in Lee's diary reads, We are going steady, and I decide I must have her. She puts me off. So, on April the 15th, I propose, and she accepts. Marina was a pharmacology graduate who had lived with her aunt and uncle since her parents died. She was young, in love, and trusted Lee implicitly. It was therefore a shock to her that he had not told her prior to their marriage that he was planning to move back to the United States. Still, she encouraged him to do what would make him happy and agreed to go with him if they could secure an exit visa for her. Matters were much more complicated than that. Lee had defected to the Soviet Union. There had been a flurry of American newsprint documenting the young Marine who had turned his back on his country. His hardship discharge from the Marine Corps had subsequently been downgraded to dishonorable discharge because of his defection. It seemed to be an open question as to whether the American authorities might even allow him to return. There was almost certainly concern that he might pose a security or intelligence risk. The process took nearly a year after Lee's first inquiry, but by March of 1962, both he and Marina received legal permission to leave the USSR together with their first child, a daughter named June, who had been born just a few weeks before, and they travelled to the United States. Lee and his young family departed Russia in the late spring of 1962. They landed first in Hoboken, New Jersey, where Lee expected that the welfare department would pay for his family's transport back to Dallas. Unbeknownst to Lee, the welfare department had reached out to his brother, Robert, who had agreed to pay $200 to cover their travel expenses. Lee was furious when he found out, but Robert assured him that he had been happy to help. The reunion between Lee and Robert was a warm and reassuring one for both brothers, and Robert and his wife and 2 children welcomed Marina and baby June. They had a few weeks of peace together before Marguerite arrived. Lee did not seem happy to see his mother. Marguerite aggravated her son by seeming to co-opt his life and experiences, and seemed only to care about how his actions affected her. She told Lee that she had travelled to Washington, D.C. after his defection to find out whether or not he was secretly serving as an American intelligence agent in Russia. If so, she had told associates of the Secretary of State she was outraged and hoped that they would bring him home because she was a poor widow who needed her son's support. She had also, she told him, been planning to write a book about his defection. This made Lee explode with anger. "You can't do that," he yelled at his mother. "They could kill her, don't you know that?" he said angrily, indicating his wife, Marina, and her danger at the hands of the potential Soviet retribution. Lee himself, however, had also been working on a manuscript, a memoir of his time in the Soviet Union, but, like many of his plans and projects, he was never able to see it through to completion. Marguerite continued to grate on Lee throughout the remainder of her visit, and his unfortunate wife, Marina, bore the brunt of his terrible temper. After a fight at the dinner table over Lee's hostile attitude towards his mother, which Marina did not understand, he struck her for the first time. It was after their return to the US during the summer of 1962 that Lee began noticeably to unravel. He was bitter that no one in the media had seemed interested in talking to him since his return from the USSR, and that his grand design as a man of history, a man destined to do something important, seemed an empty notion. He bounced around from one job to the next, staying no more than 2 or 3 months in any one position before quitting or getting fired. His treatment of Marina worsened through the fall and winter of 1962 to 1963. What began as slaps were now punches, and Marina frequently showed up with bruises and sometimes a black eye. She had made friends with a group of Russian émigrés, but they soon began to drift away. They liked Marina, but found Lee off-putting and arrogant and stopped visiting her when it became clear that she would not divorce her obviously abusive husband. Within a year, their home life became untenable. Even though Marina was pregnant again, she and Lee experienced several separations beginning in 1963. Lee would take temporary accommodation in a rooming house after a fight until they could work it out. But both his mental state and their marriage only seemed to deteriorate further. He became more and more secretive and withdrawn from her. In January of 1963, Lee created a fake ID in the name of Alec James Heidel, with which he purchased by mail a handgun and a Carcano rifle. His purchase of these firearms under a false name almost certainly indicates that he was already planning an act of violence. Lee asked Marina to take photographs of him holding the rifle, and in a photo that has since become famous, Oswald appears posing in his backyard with the rifle in hand, a pistol holstered at his waist, and copies of 2 newspapers, The Worker and The Militant, in his other hand. Later that month, he instructed his wife to write to the Soviet embassy in Washington to request that she and June be allowed to return to Russia, which Marina emphatically did not wish to do, and it showed in the letter she wrote. The phrases were casual, artless, and less than persuasive. A friend of the Oswalds, George de Meurenschild, recalled several conversations he had had with Lee in early 1963 about retired General Edwin Walker, member of the notably right-wing John Birch Society and fervent racial segregationist, whom both Lee and George considered to be a dangerous fascist. The world would have cause to be grateful to whomever got rid of that man, George exclaimed to Lee, who admired the older man a great deal. By late February and early March, Lee was studying maps of the neighborhood around General Walker's home. He also penned a personal political manifesto and historical treatise which, no doubt, he expected to be publicized after he committed his act of violence. "No rational man," Lee wrote, "can take the attitude of a curse on both your houses. There are two world systems, one twisted beyond recognition, the other decadent and dying. A truly democratic system would combine the better qualities of the two upon an American foundation opposed to both." Lee's manifesto insisted that no individual should own the means of production. He championed the rights of personal property, religious tolerance, and freedom of travel, free speech, no individual income tax, but heavy corporate taxes, free health care, strict gun control, and full military disarmament, with the exception of small arms for civil police forces. On the evening of the 10th of April, Oswald quietly left his home with his Carcano rifle secreted in a paper sack. He concealed himself among some shrubbery, some distance from General Walker's office window, and used the rifle's telescopic sight to line up his shot. Walker was ultimately saved from assassination because he moved his head at the last second when Oswald fired at him through his office window. Instead of striking Walker directly, the bullet passed through the upper part of the window frame, and the general sustained only minor injuries from stray bullet fragments. Towards the end of April, perhaps to escape the heat of potential discovery for his attempted assassination of Walker, Lee went to New Orleans to look for work while Marina and June went to stay with friends in Irving, Texas. Lee got a job working for a coffee company and sent Marina money for herself and the baby. Over the next few weeks, he became involved with an organization called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a pro-Castro political group, and basically became a one-man silo of operation for the group in New Orleans. While handing out leaflets in downtown New Orleans, he got into an angry dispute with anti-Castro Cuban exiles, which turned violent. He was later invited to participate in a debate on WDSU, a local radio station, with the leaders of the right-wing Anti-Castro Information Council of the Americas, or INCA, against whose arguments Oswald's rather idealistic beliefs appeared to crumble. In September, Lee traveled to Mexico. He visited both the Cuban and Soviet embassies there, where he applied for visas to both countries. Neither embassy was willing to grant him a visa. He had returned to the US from Russia less than 2 years before, hoping to find the future. Now, balked in his purposes, lost and disillusioned, he sought to run away again. Unable even to do that, Lee finally returned to Dallas, defeated. One of Lee's and Marina's neighbors in Dallas was able to help Lee get the last job he would ever hold, filling textbook orders at the Texas School Book Depository. The birth of a second daughter, Rachel, just 3 days after his 24th birthday, seemed to raise his spirits and inspire some renewed care and affection for his family, but ultimately, even this failed to arrest his descent into hopelessness and violence. It is unclear when Oswald first began to conceive of assassinating President John F. Kennedy, and it remains even less clear today exactly why he did it. Marina later testified after Lee's death that she and her husband had regularly watched the Kennedys on television and had discussed the president's policies, and she had never believed that Lee even disliked Kennedy, either personally or politically. In fact, she believed that Lee had admired him. One biographer has speculated that JFK may have represented to Lee his polar opposite, someone who aggravated him just by simply existing. Lee likely fancied himself every bit as intelligent and capable as Kennedy, and yet Lee was a disappointing spectre next to the seemingly dependable solidity of the president. Kennedy had distinguished himself bravely in World War II, while Oswald's military career had ended in disgrace. Kennedy had penned a celebrated book right out of Harvard, while Oswald had been a 10th grade dropout. The Kennedys were fabulously rich, while he had always been poor. Kennedy had achieved dizzying success in his political career by the time he was barely 40. Oswald had always been a loser, and thanks to his dramatically unstable childhood, he had no ability to persevere in the pursuit of any goal. Worse, no matter where, how far, or how often he ran away from himself, he could never escape, and this realization invariably led him to violence. And yet, all this is perhaps no more than speculation. Perhaps Oswald did not intend to kill Kennedy at all, until he learned from newspapers just a few days before the president's arrival that not only would Kennedy visit Dallas, but his motorcade route would pass right by the Texas School Book Depository in Dealey Plaza, where Oswald had been hired only a month before. Perhaps he bore Kennedy no ill will at all, and Oswald's plan to assassinate the president was simply his final attempt to become a man of history, to make sure his name would be remembered for something before he could finally find his peace in death. On the evening of the 21st of November 1963, Lee went to see Marina in a last-ditch attempt to fully reconcile with her. When he finally departed the next morning, Marina discovered that Lee had left his wedding ring behind. On the morning of the 22nd of November 1963, one of Lee's co-workers arrived to give him a ride to work. He later testified that Lee carried a long, slim package with him, wrapped in brown paper, which he claimed contained curtain rods. At lunchtime, when the rest of his co-workers were eating lunch and trying to find the best viewing spots on the 5th floor of the Texas School Book Depository from which to watch President and Mrs. Kennedy drive by, Lee made his way to the 6th floor. Behind a large stack of boxes, he positioned himself at the southeast corner window, his rifle close at hand. When the president's slow-moving motorcade turned into Dealey Plaza, cheers and greetings erupted among the assembled crowds. One spectator happened to glance up to the 6th floor window and caught sight of Oswald, whom he assumed must be a police sniper placed there to guard the president. The open-topped car was no more than 30 or 40 feet beyond the depository building when Oswald fired 3 shots. The first tore through the back of the president's neck, exiting at his throat and passing through Texas Governor Nelson Connally, who was sitting in front of Kennedy. The second shot missed. The third shot struck Kennedy in the back of the head, and he slumped forward as the crowd around him screamed and Secret Service agents and Dallas police officers converged on the car. 2 of Lee's co-workers who were watching the president's motorcade from the 5th floor later testified that they were certain that the 3 shots had come from the 6th floor above them, and that they had heard each of the 3 bullet casings strike the floor above them, one after the other. After firing 3 shots, Lee immediately hid the gun under a pile of boxes and quickly made his way back downstairs to the lunchroom. A police captain was already there, questioning the staff. Lee slipped out of the building, but his supervisor was quick to notice that following the shooting of President Kennedy, Oswald was now the only member of his staff unaccounted for. A citywide dispatch with Lee's name and physical description was issued to all Dallas police officers. After leaving work, Lee went home, changed clothes, and collected his pistol. On his way back downtown, he was stopped by Patrol Officer J.D. Tippit, who believed that Oswald fitted the description of the president's suspected assassin. Tippit asked Lee to show him some identification. While making a show of searching his pockets for it, Lee instead produced his gun and shot Tippit dead. The policeman's death was witnessed by no less than 9 people. A shop owner saw Lee less than 20 minutes later, loitering in the doorway of his shop and looking around anxiously, the gun tucked into the back of his pants clearly visible. The shop owner watched Lee make his way furtively up the street and disappear into a movie theater. The police found him there less than half an hour later. He was taken into custody with no small amount of violence. He tried, but failed, to shoot the arresting officer and then struck the officer in the face. The officer punched Lee squarely in the eye, doubling him over before he finally cuffed him. Oswald was bundled into a police cruiser minutes later, screaming that he was the victim of police brutality. Dallas police interrogated Lee for 2 days. He confessed to shooting Officer Tippit, but refused to confess to President Kennedy's murder, despite the mounting number of witnesses and growing amount of hard physical evidence against him. On the night of 23rd of November, Lee received a visit from Marguerite and Marina. It was the last time that either his mother or his wife would see him alive. The next day, as Oswald was being moved from the Dallas City Jail to the county jail, a local club owner named Jack Ruby waited among a crush of reporters and photographers who were all trying at the same time to get a quote from Oswald or a photograph of him. When Oswald drew close enough, Ruby sprang forward, the pistol in his hand suddenly visible, and shot Lee in the abdomen. Ruby later told the police that he had been utterly outraged at Oswald's crime. He had wanted, he said, to spare poor Mrs. Kennedy from having to look her husband's killer in the face and then suffer the injustice of seeing him merely sent to prison while her husband lay in the ground. Oswald was taken to Parkland Hospital, the same hospital to which Kennedy had been taken just 2 days before. That night, Lee Harvey Oswald succumbed to his injuries, dying at the age of 24. Lee Harvey Oswald died a thoroughly hated and reviled man by the general public. The only people who attended his funeral were Marina and her 2 daughters, Lee's mother Marguerite, and his brother Robert. Several clergymen refused to perform the service, either because of what Lee had done, or because they feared further violence might break out at the gravesite. With no mourners present, willing or able to serve as pallbearers, Lee's coffin was borne to his final resting place by 6 news reporters who attended the funeral. Lee's headstone, bearing his full name, was stolen from the Rose Hill Cemetery in Dallas just 3 years after his death. Marguerite replaced it with one that simply reads Oswald. Marguerite, whose self-absorption and sense of personal entitlement seemed only to have increased over the years, told a reporter in 1965 that she was proud of her boy, and that she was sure history would remember him well, and that few people had done as much for their country as her son had. Marguerite died in 1981, and throughout the remainder of her life, she continually sought to cash in on her son's terrible notoriety, charging for interviews and selling Lee's possessions and documents. She could even be found in Dealey Plaza over the years, selling business cards which read, Marguerite Oswald, mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, for $5 apiece. After her death, Marguerite was laid to rest in Rose Hill Cemetery next to her son Lee, as she had wished. It is far less certain that Lee himself would ever have wished for his mother to be buried next to him. More than 2,000 books have been written about the Kennedy assassination, a staggering number which overwhelmingly dwarfs the amount of biographical information which had been written about Lee Harvey Oswald himself. The horror and shock which Americans experienced at the death of JFK seemed utterly egregious and senseless. In such situations, people grope for reasons, for explanations. There is something comforting about conspiracies, one Kennedy assassination scholar has written. Conspiracies give some rhyme or reason to terrible events. The thought that a single, isolated, and deeply disturbed individual could blow up American history and society for no good reason was utterly incomprehensible to millions of Americans. Further, the Kennedy assassination was the first of a series of historical events which, over time, contributed to an overwhelming loss of trust in government and institutions. The 60s saw several more high-profile assassinations, including Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, Dr. Martin Luther King, and JFK's brother, Bobby Kennedy. The bombing of helpless civilians in Vietnam and Cambodia through the late 60s and early 70s during the Vietnam War and the persistence of the military draft galvanized an entire generation of young people against the U.S. government. Nixon's Watergate scandal and President Gerald Ford's pardon of Nixon disgusted and demoralized nearly half the country. In such an environment, the findings of the Warren Commission, the body tasked by President Lyndon Johnson with investigating Kennedy's assassination, were called into more and more serious doubt as the years passed. Numerous conspiracy theories have flourished in the years since 1963, most of which continue to insist that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone. Speculation about fellow perpetrators has varied extremely widely. Organized crime, the KGB, anti-Castro Cubans, the CIA, even Vice President Johnson himself have all been held up as possible co-conspirators. As late as 1978, a congressional committee was still examining and debating the veracity of evidence that there were more than 3 gunshots, and therefore more than one shooter. In 1992, in the interest of cultivating public trust, the United States Congress passed an act ordering the CIA and FBI to hand over all classified files pertaining to the Kennedy assassination to NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration. NARA was then given a deadline of 25 years to unredact and organize more than 50,000 classified documents. The first of these were released to the public beginning in the early 2000s. When the deadline for full release of the documents arrived in 2017, US President Donald Trump reportedly bowed to protestation from American intelligence agencies that, for national security reasons and other confidentiality restrictions, several thousand documents could not yet be released. In 2021, President Joe Biden followed suit, allowing intelligence agencies to continue keeping nearly 5,000 documents classified for the foreseeable future. This delay naturally makes some historians and journalists suspicious, as well as crazy with curiosity, but the most respected and reputable scholars of the Kennedy assassination are highly skeptical that a smoking gun of any kind will be found in the documents still unclassified. Most of those we've already seen have added nothing, if not greater weight, to the original findings of the Warren Commission that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Further, conspiracy theories nourished for decades have only weakened under new evidence, as well as under re-examinations of old evidence with more modern and accurate investigation techniques. Scholars who have closely read the more than 18,000 pages of the Warren Commission's report have few, if any, doubts that Oswald acted alone. Few conspiracy theorists, on the other hand, seem to have read the quite exhaustive reports of the original investigation. Several excellent biographies of Lee Harvey Oswald have been written and published over the last 2 decades. The scholars who wrote them all note a particularly important point about the Kennedy assassination. Many investigators were so wrapped up in ballistics reports, camera angles, sound analysis from live recordings, and numerous suspicions of political or mob connections to Oswald, the evidence for which was tenuous at best, that everybody forgot to take a closer look at Oswald himself. The fact that he was murdered 2 days after killing Kennedy robbed Americans of the opportunity to confront both Oswald and his hideous crime. He should have faded into obscurity in jail, like most assassins, but the manner of his death made it nearly impossible for some people to believe that his killing had not been an attempt to silence him. However, after a thorough investigation of Oswald's life, his behavior and his writings, it becomes much easier to see and track the descent of a man into madness and violence. What do you think about Lee Harvey Oswald? Was his decision to kill President Kennedy most likely entirely his own, and arose primarily from his own tortured psyche and painful past? Or, like so many who still cannot quite banish their doubts that JFK's assassination was the result of a conspiracy, are you still waiting for the release of those last few thousand documents which remain classified? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.